I can still see that morning as if it's frozen in glass. The sun had barely lifted above Durham, the light spilling through my kitchen blinds in thin, pale stripes. My house was too quiet for a place that had once been filled with Vernon's voice, his laughter, his shuffle of slippers across the hardwood. That morning was supposed to be ordinary. I had a meeting downtown with the lawyer to go over Vernon's estate, business I dreaded but knew had to be faced. I reached for my favorite mug, the one Vernon bought me years ago from a roadside antique shop, with little roses painted around the rim. I poured the coffee, dark and steady, its steam rising like the promise of comfort. I lifted it halfway to my lips when I heard the sharp cry of my grandson's voice. "Grandma, don't drink it." The sound cut through the kitchen like a blade. I turned. Javon was standing in the doorway, pajama shirt crooked, his little fists balled at his sides. He was only 9 years old, but his eyes were wide, old with fear. "What did you say?" I asked, my voice low. "Don't drink it." Mommy did something bad. My blood froze. For a second, the world slowed. The steam rising from the cup seemed heavier, sinister. I set the mug back down on the counter, staring at the surface as it rippled from the slight shake of my hand. Coffee shouldn't look like poison, but in that moment it did. I wanted to believe Javon was confused, but the truth is children don't invent things like that. Not with that kind of terror in their eyes. My chest tightened as I realized what had nearly happened. My own family wanted me gone. That was the moment I stopped being just a widow going through paperwork. That was the moment I became a survivor in my own home. My name is Melba Glass. And before I tell you how I walked into that lawyer's office still alive, I want to ask you something because I've asked myself this question more times than I can count. If your own child tried to poison you, would you forgive them? Just answer me in the comments with a yes or no. Don't think too hard. Your gut will tell you. I straightened my navy dress, smoothed my trembling hands against the fabric, and took Javon's small hand in mine. Together, we stepped out of that house and into a day that would decide everything. The coffee sat untouched on the counter, but its shadow followed me all the way downtown to the inheritance meeting where the real unraveling was about to begin. Before I walk you deeper into the poison that nearly ended me, you need to know the man whose hands built the life they were so eager to tear apart. My Vernon wasn't a man of grand speeches or shiny titles. He was a worker, 35 years on the floor of the textile plant in Durham, his palms thick with calluses, and the smell of cotton dust clinging to his shirts even after the wash. He left for work before sunrise and came home with his back bent, but his spirit unbroken. That man's steady hands carried me through every season of our marriage. When we first bought our house in the early 1980s, folks said we were crazy. The neighborhood was still rough, then a patch of Durham where porch lights stayed off after dark. But Vernon saw what others didn't. "This place will be ours. Melba," he told me, standing in the backyard with a hammer in his grip. "One day you'll see." And he was right. We watched the neighborhood bloom around us. The porch I used to sweep barefooted became a place where neighbors stopped to talk. And the house, our house, stood as proof that patience and sweat could turn doubt into pride. By the time Vernon retired, the home was worth 4 times what we paid for it. He never bragged about that. He just leaned back in his recliner, sipping sweet tea, watching his grandson, Javon, play on the same floorboards our son, Patrick, once raced across as a boy. That house wasn't just wood and bricks. It was our memory bank, a vessel holding decades of birthdays, Sunday dinners, and the smell of Vernon's cologne that still lingered on his side of the closet. Vernon wasn't one to chase money, but he knew how to save. His pension, our joint savings, and the 2 rental properties he insisted on buying in the 90s created a cushion we didn't flaunt. It wasn't a fortune by Wall Street standards, but it was comfort. It was safety. By the time cancer took him in 2017, Vernon left behind nearly $600,000 in savings, our family home, and those 2 rentals that had tenants paying steady each month. But death has a way of turning love into numbers. What Vernon built as a shelter for his family turned into a battlefield the moment he was lowered into the ground. Patrick saw assets, not memories. Where I saw the bricks Vernon laid with his own 2 hands, Patrick saw dollar signs and debt relief. He wasn't thinking about the years Vernon walked through that door with aching feet. He was thinking about creditors calling his phone and in-laws breathing down his neck. I'll tell you something that hurts to admit. When Vernon and I drew up his will, I never once thought we needed to guard against our own child. Vernon made me co-owner of the house, co-owner of the rentals, and we put clear terms in place to provide for Patrick when the time came. It was simple, straightforward. But greed doesn't read the fine print. It only sees opportunity. So when I sat in that kitchen staring at the cup of poisoned coffee, I wasn't just holding a mug. I was holding the weight of a house, of a lifetime, of a man's legacy that somebody I birthed was willing to destroy for cash. The thought chilled me deeper than the poison ever could have. They say every brick tells a story, but in my house, the bricks told 2, Vernon's story of sacrifice and Patrick's story of betrayal. That's why the estate meeting mattered so much. It wasn't just about money. It was about whether my husband's life's work would continue to shelter the family he left behind, or be squandered by the son who had lost his way. I didn't know it yet, but the very home Vernon built with love would soon become the battleground where blood and loyalty collided, and where I would have to choose between saving my son or saving the legacy of the man who never once failed me. When people see a man in a pressed shirt and clean shoes, they assume he's steady. They don't ask what's waiting when he empties his pockets at night. Patrick, my only son, carried himself like everything was under control. To the neighbors, he was the polite young man who helped carry groceries, the family man with a wife and child. But paper doesn't lie, and paper was what I would later find stacked high in drawers, hidden in glove compartments, and stuffed in shoeboxes under his bed. Patrick's fall didn't happen overnight. It started small, poker nights with coworkers at the logistics warehouse where he worked, then bets on college basketball games, then the online sites where you don't see the money leave your hand, only numbers ticking down on a glowing screen. At first, he bragged about winning, but gamblers always brag louder about wins than losses. And behind those stories were weeks when the paycheck vanished before it even cleared the bank. Then came Kenyetta's family. They were people who had never known discipline with a dollar. Her brothers were always in between jobs. Her parents lived on credit cards that maxed out quicker than they could be replaced. When they pitched a trucking venture to Patrick, promising it would double his money, he signed on without hesitation. He co-signed loans, poured in savings, and carried debts that didn't even have his name on them. And when the trucks broke down, when fuel prices rose, when the business folded, Patrick was the one the collectors called. By the time Vernon passed, Patrick and Kenyetta were drowning in nearly $180,000 of combined debt. Creditors were circling like vultures, calling at every hour. Some of those debts weren't even on paper. They were owed to men you don't invite into your home, men who don't care if you're a husband or a father, only that you pay what you promised. I would later hear from one of them at my own door, his voice slick and sharp. Tell Patrick we don't wait. That was when I understood the kind of fire he had been playing with. But instead of stepping back, Patrick leaned in deeper. He started talking to Kenyatta about my house, about Vernon's savings, about the rental income that came steady every month. To him, Vernon's death wasn't just grief. It was timing. The estate was money waiting to be unlocked, a chance to wipe the slate clean and start again. Only problem was me, as co-owner. As widow, I was the wall between his hunger and his relief. And so desperation twisted itself into betrayal. Patrick didn't just stumble into his wife's scheme. He invited it. He told her what he wanted, promised her a larger share if she played her part. To him, it was numbers on a ledger. To her, it was a way to rescue her family from collapse. To both of them, my life was the price they were willing to pay. The thing about debt is it doesn't just empty your wallet, it hollows your soul. It makes men choose silence over honor, shortcuts over patience. Patrick, my boy who once held my hand on the first day of school, became a man who looked at me and saw a barrier. And barriers in his world had to be removed. When Javon stood in my kitchen that morning and cried, "Grandma, don't drink it," Mommy did something bad. I didn't yet know the full mountain pressing down on his father. I didn't know about the loan sharks or the forged signatures or the late-night gambling losses. But I felt the weight in my bones. Only desperation makes a man feed poison to his own mother. Only debt, so deep it drowns you, makes you forget whose blood runs in your veins. What Patrick didn't understand was this. Vernon built with bricks, Patrick built with lies. And lies, no matter how carefully stacked, always collapse under their own weight. Grief changes the sound of a house. After Vernon passed, nights felt different, like the walls themselves held their breath. I told myself it was just the silence of widowhood, but even silence can carry secrets. At first, it was small things. A half-closed door down the hall with the faint buzz of voices leaking through. Patrick's tone, lower than usual, words sharp like he didn't want them carried. Kenyatta whispering back, sometimes in fast bursts, sometimes in pauses so heavy I swore I could hear her heart beating through the drywall. I would walk past, and they'd fall quiet pretending to scroll their phones or asking me about the weather. I wanted to believe it was nothing. Every family argues, but something in their voices carried a weight I couldn't name yet. The phone calls came next. Late nights when my old bones begged for rest. I'd wake to the creak of floorboards. I'd see the glow of a cell phone screen bouncing off Patrick's face in the dark kitchen. His shoulders hunched, his voice clipped, whispering, "I'll get it, just wait, not yet." Once I stepped in and asked if everything was all right. He smiled too fast. "Work call," he said. At 2 a.m, I swallowed it, because sometimes mothers would rather believe a lie than face what truth might cost. But Javon, he was the one listening without the shield of denial. Children notice the cracks we cover. His bedroom sat right next to the one Patrick and Kenyatta shared. While I tossed in bed, trying to sleep, he lay awake with his ear pressed to the wall. Later, he told me about words I never heard. Words like coffee and before the meeting, and she has to be gone. He told me about how his father's voice dropped to a growl, and how his mother's laughter didn't sound like laughter at all. I didn't know it then, but that little boy was piecing together a puzzle that would save my life. He carried their secrets like a stone on his chest, quiet, waiting for the moment when he couldn't hold it anymore. Looking back, the coffee wasn't the beginning. It was just the boldest strike after a string of smaller shadows I had ignored, chalking them up to grief or old age. But grief doesn't loosen banisters. Grief doesn't sour greens for one plate alone. Grief doesn't turn knobs on a stove. The first time came just 2 weeks after Vernon's funeral. Neighbors had dropped off food, as they do in the South when a woman is left alone. I hadn't had the strength to cook, so when Kenyatta set a steaming pot of collard greens on my counter, I accepted with a tired thank you. I ate one serving, and within the hour, my stomach twisted, heat rushing through me like fire in my veins. I lay curled on the couch, sweating, praying it would pass. Nobody else had touched that pot. Patrick and Kenyatta claimed they'd already eaten. At the time, I thought maybe it was spoiled meat or my nerves. Only later did I see it for what it was, a trial run. Then came the banister. Vernon had built that porch himself, measured and nailed every board. For 30 years, that railing never once wobbled under the weight of kids playing or neighbors leaning. One afternoon, I stepped out with a basket of laundry. My hand gripped the post, and it slid loose, nearly sending me tumbling down the steps. Patrick rushed out at the sound of my gasp, said he must have been meaning to fix it. Fix what? That rail had been solid since Reagan was in office. My heart thudded, but I brushed it off. Age makes you question your own memory. The last was the stove. It was late, one of those restless nights when sleep won't settle. I walked into the kitchen and stopped cold. The faint hiss of gas, the smell sharp enough to sting my nose. I hadn't cooked that day. I hadn't touched the stove. Yet there it was, the dial barely turned, quiet poison waiting for a spark. I opened every window, sat at the table until dawn, staring at the knob. I told myself maybe I brushed it without noticing. Maybe Javon, curious as boys are, had wandered too close. But in my bones, I knew. These things stack up like bricks in a wall you don't want to see built. At first, you think they're accidents. But accidents don't repeat themselves in different shapes, all aimed at the same body. They were laying the ground long before that coffee mug steamed in my hand. The hardest part is realizing how willingly I excused it. I was a woman trying to survive the loss of a husband, not ready to believe the loss of a son's love would follow so soon. But each of those moments, greens, banister, stove, were rehearsals. Rehearsals for a final act they hoped would be quiet, clean, and unquestioned. When Javon shouted that morning, "Grandma, don't drink it," Mommy did something bad. The puzzle snapped into place. My sickness, my stumble, that hiss of gas, none of it was random. It was all part of the same hand, Patrick's hand, steadying the knife while Kenyatta pressed it closer. The coffee might have been the climax, but the shadows had been moving for months. I just hadn't let myself see them. Downtown Durham, that morning looked like it always did. Office workers clutching paper cups, traffic lights flickering against glass windows, the steady hum of a city too busy to care about who lived or who died. But for me, every sound felt sharper, every step heavier. I wasn't just walking into a lawyer's office. I was walking into the theater where betrayal was about to meet daylight. I held Javon's hand as we crossed the street. His small fingers wrapped tight around mine like he knew I needed him more than he needed me. Beside us, two plainclothes detectives moved at a quiet distance, blending into the crowd. They had told me to carry on as normal, to let things unfold. Normal? How do you carry normal when you've nearly swallowed your own death at the breakfast table? The building itself was one of those brick downtown relics, 3 stories tall, with polished brass letters that spelled out Law Offices of Charles M. Harlan. I had walked through that door before with Vernon at my side, his arm steady against mine as we signed papers about wills and deeds, never imagining those documents would become weapons in our own family's war. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old books and fresh ink. The receptionist smiled, offered a polite nod, and motioned us toward the conference room. My heels clicked against the tile like a drumbeat counting down. Javon's sneakers shuffled beside me, and in my other hand, I carried the mug, not to drink from, but to place like evidence. The same roses painted on its rim now looked like stains. Patrick and Kenyatta were already there, seated across from the lawyer's polished oak table. Patrick looked restless, tapping his fingers against his thigh, eyes darting between me and the door as though every second delayed his payday. Kenyatta sat rigid, her hair pulled back tight, lips pressed into a line too straight to be calm. Mrs. Glass, Mr. Glass, the lawyer greeted, adjusting his glasses. His voice was steady, professional, but even he could sense the air wasn't right. I took my seat. Javon sat close, his hand still clinging to mine under the table. Slowly, deliberately, I set the mug down in front of me. The porcelain hit the wood with a soft clink that echoed far louder in that room than it should have. Kenyatta's eyes locked on it, and I watched the color drain from her face. Her composure cracked like glass struck with a hammer. Her breath hitched, her shoulders stiffened. Then, without a word, she slumped forward. The chair scraped back, and her body crumpled to the floor. The room erupted, lawyer shouting for help, Patrick stumbling to his feet, his hands fluttering like he didn't know whether to touch her or to run. The receptionist rushed in, phone in hand, calling for an ambulance. The detectives, silent until then, moved closer, their eyes on every detail. And me, I sat still, my hand resting gently on Javon's shoulder. My heart didn't race. My breath didn't quicken. I had expected a storm, but what I saw was a collapse. She fainted at the sight of the very cup she thought would carry me to my grave. They carried her out on a stretcher, Patrick babbling excuses. She's been under stress. It's too much, the funeral, the estate. The lawyer frowned, his pen tapping against his pad, suspicion flickering in his eyes, though his words remained neutral. As the ambulance doors closed, I caught my reflection in the glass. A widow, yes, but not a victim. I hadn't come downtown just to sign papers. I had come to show them I was still alive, and that survival itself was the first piece of evidence against them. That day in the lawyer's office was the pivot, the moment the poison they poured in my cup spilled back into their own laps. The faint was only the beginning. The unraveling had just started. If you've never sat across from police officers while your heart is still pounding from a brush with death, let me tell you, it's a strange kind of silence. The kind where you expect iron bars to slam, handcuffs to click, justice to march in neat lines. But instead, you get paper forms, shrugs, and words that sound more like excuses than protection. After Kenyatta fainted at the lawyer's office, they wheeled her into Durham General. I followed close behind, detectives at my side, convinced this was it. She had cracked. A woman doesn't drop at the sight of a coffee mug unless guilt is heavier than her body can carry. I sat in that hospital hallway, Javon's head against my shoulder, listening to the buzz of machines and the squeak of nurses' shoes, waiting for the moment they would come out and tell me she had confessed. But when the door opened, all I got were officers with tired faces. "She's saying it was stress, Mrs. Glass." One of them told me, his voice flat like he'd repeated that line too many times. "We don't have enough to hold her." Not enough. I could feel my voice climbing, my palms trembling against my lap. She tried to put poison in my cup. My grandson heard her. You saw her collapse when she laid eyes on it. He shifted his weight, eyes darting toward his partner before looking back at me. "There's no confession, no toxicology report yet. Right now, it's just circumstantial. The DA won't touch it." I wanted to scream. Instead, I sat there with my jaw clenched so tight, I thought my teeth would break. The law, the system, things Vernon always believed in, were suddenly a wall I couldn't climb. My husband worked a lifetime, paid his taxes, built his legacy by the book, and here I was told that almost dying wasn't enough. Patrick arrived at the hospital late, all false worry painted across his face. "How's she doing? Is she all right?" His voice cracked in just the right places, as if he'd rehearsed it. He didn't look at me. Not once. That's when I knew he was in it as deep as she was. I walked out before they finished their act. The night air hit my face like a slap. The detectives followed me to the parking lot, offering careful words. "We'll keep digging. Stay cautious." But I wasn't interested in caution anymore. I was interested in survival. That night, I didn't return to my house. I didn't pack carefully or write notes. I took Javon by the hand, grabbed a few clothes, and walked out with my keys in my pocket and my heart pounding against my ribs. We drove across town to a friend's spare room, and for the first time in weeks, I locked a door and felt like it meant something. It's a hard truth to swallow, but that was the night I understood. Justice doesn't arrive just because you deserve it. Sometimes it drags its feet. Sometimes it looks the other way. And sometimes it forces you to fight for it with your own bare hands. The police might have left her free, but I wasn't about to leave myself unguarded. That night was the beginning of my own investigation. If they wouldn't deliver justice, I would carve a path to it myself. There's a certain humility in packing a life into one duffel bag. I didn't take jewelry, didn't take keepsakes. Just a few changes of clothes for me and Javon, and a Bible Vernon had underlined so much it looked more like a map than scripture. When I pulled into my friend Laureen's driveway that night, headlights washing over her little white bungalow, I felt the weight of everything I'd left behind. My home, the house Vernon built with sweat and stubborn hands, no longer felt safe. To stay, there would have been to hand my life over like a set of spare keys. Laureen opened her door before I knocked. We'd known each other 40 years, back when our boys played Little League on fields with crooked bases. She didn't ask questions, not then. She just pressed her hand to my arm and said, "You and the boy are safe here." That was enough. Her spare room smelled faintly of lavender, a quilt folded neatly at the end of the bed. Javon climbed in, his small body curling tight like a question mark. I kissed his forehead, sat on the edge of the mattress until his breathing evened, watching him sleep in someone else's house, knowing his parents had plotted death at my kitchen table, cut deeper than any knife could. Betrayal has a way of hollowing you from the inside, leaving only resolve to fill the space. I lay awake long after, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow circles. Vernon's voice drifted back to me, something he said more than once. Melba, always keep records. Papers don't lie, even when people do. He was right. He'd saved receipts from 30 years ago, filed away letters, stored every deed, and contract like they were gold. At the time, I teased him, called him obsessive. Now, those words came back like prophecy. The next morning, I returned to my house while Patrick and Kenyatta were at work. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door, every creak sounding like danger. But I wasn't there to linger. I was there to dig. I pulled out Vernon's metal lockbox, heavy and stubborn to open, filled with documents neatly stacked in his careful handwriting. Property deeds, bank statements, his will, the official copy. I flipped through page after page, letting the smell of old paper steady me. Then I turned to Patrick's room. Drawers, shoeboxes. That's where the mask slipped. Bills shoved deep, loan agreements unsigned, scribbled notes about payments after Mom's gone. My breath caught. It wasn't just a plan, it was already in motion. Creditors had been promised money from Vernon's estate, money Patrick didn't even control. He had already gambled away a future that wasn't his to give. I sat on the edge of his bed, papers spread across my lap, and felt something shift. Fear had carried me this far. But in that moment, fear hardened into strategy. The police might have let her walk out of the hospital free, but I had something stronger than suspicion. I had Vernon's habit of keeping records and Patrick's carelessness of leaving trails. That night back at Laureen's, I began sorting it all, page by page, a puzzle of lies taking shape. Betrayal had dragged me out of my own home, but it also lit a fire in me. If my son and his wife wanted to erase me, they underestimated the woman Vernon married. Because I wasn't just a widow anymore. I was an archivist of truth, and every piece of paper I touched was another brick in the case I was building against them. It was the weight of the paper that gave it away. Vernon's will, the true one, sat heavy in my lap inside its blue-backed folder, stamped and sealed. I had seen it before, signed it with him in that lawyer's office, my hand trembling from the solemnity of it all. That document was clean, precise, written in the same careful hand Vernon always used when it came to serious matters. But tucked into Patrick's drawer, under a stack of unpaid credit card bills and a pawnshop receipt, I found another version. At first glance, it tried to mimic the original. The pages were laid out the same, the language nearly identical. But the details, Lord, the details screamed of arrogance. Dates were off by weeks. Property descriptions weren't exact. And Vernon's signature, my God, it looked like a child tracing over a name he barely remembered. The V was jagged, the spacing uneven. My husband spent his whole life signing time cards and contracts with that steady right hand, and this was a crooked shadow. My breath caught as I held it to the light, my hands trembling so hard the paper rattled. The longer I looked, the clearer it became. Patrick hadn't just been scheming with whispered words and poisoned cups. He had crossed the line into crime, attempting to rewrite his father's final word with his own hand. I could almost hear Vernon in that moment, that deep baritone of his, "Melba, paper don't lie." And this paper didn't. It testified against the very son he had once carried on his shoulders at the county fair. I slid the forgery into a folder of my own, tucked it under my arm, and drove straight to the lawyer's office. Every stoplight seemed to hold its breath. I gripped the steering wheel tight, not from the traffic, but from the weight of what I was carrying, a document that could burn away every mask Patrick still wore. When I arrived, the lawyer's secretary looked up, surprised to see me without an appointment. I didn't wait. I walked straight into his office, laid both wills on his polished desk, and stepped back like I was laying down evidence in a trial. He adjusted his glasses, compared the pages, then looked at me over the rims with eyes sharper than any knife. "Mrs. Glass," he said slowly, "this isn't just suspicious. This is fraud. Fraud." The word settled in the air, like a hammer strike. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was criminal. My son had tried to rewrite history with ink, to carve me out of my husband's legacy with a pen stroke. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, staring at the two documents lying side by side, Vernon's steady truth and Patrick's sloppy lie. It was the clearest picture yet of the boy I raised and the man he had become. When I left that office, the folder felt heavier than when I'd arrived, not because of the paper itself, but because of what it meant. Patrick hadn't just been careless or desperate. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. That night, as I tucked Javon into bed at Laureen's, I kissed his forehead and whispered a promise only he could hear. "We're going to see this through." Because if Patrick thought he could forge his father's signature, he hadn't yet reckoned with the strength of his mother's. Some truths come at you like a slap. Others spread slow, like ink bleeding through paper until every corner is stained. That's how it felt as I sat on the floor of Laureen's spare room with stacks of documents spread around me, my husband's careful records on one side, Patrick's careless trails on the other, two worlds colliding, one built with discipline, the other collapsing under deceit. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Patrick hadn't just been waiting for Vernon's estate. He had already spent it. The first papers were bad enough. Loan agreements signed with shaky signatures, interest rates so high they looked like punishments. But then I found the promises, letters and emails where Patrick had written creditors bold assurances, funds secured after estate settlement. Inheritance money will cover the balance. My eyes skimmed line after line, my stomach sinking. He had pledged his father's sweat, my roof, the very walls of our home, to men who didn't care 1 ounce about family. And it wasn't just banks. There were names I didn't recognize, private lenders, cash advance outfits, and worse, handwritten notes with phone numbers and amounts scrawled beside them. Debts that didn't live on credit reports, but in back rooms with locked doors. It chilled me, thinking about the kind of men he had sat across from, the kind of pressure that must have curled around his neck. Still, it didn't excuse it. Debt may twist a man, but it doesn't force his hand to pour poison into his mother's cup. The scope of it was staggering. Nearly $200,000 in total, much of it tied directly to promises about Vernon's estate. He hadn't waited for probate. He hadn't respected the law or his father's name. He had mortgaged a future that didn't belong to him. Every page I touched made it clearer. Patrick wasn't planning to inherit. He was planning to liquidate. And the only thing standing in his way was me. I remember holding one bank statement where his account bled red ink, overdraft after overdraft, while my husband's accounts, the ones Vernon tended like a garden, still sat steady. It was like staring at two reflections, one man who built, another who squandered. I thought of Vernon, how he used to double knot his work boots, how he used to sit at the kitchen table counting every bill before folding them into envelopes for utilities, groceries, savings. And then I thought of Patrick scribbling his father's name onto a forged will, promising strangers money from a dead man's pocket. That's when it hit me like a stone. This wasn't desperation alone. This was betrayal sharpened into greed. By the time I gathered it all into neat piles, my body trembled not from fear, but from clarity. Vernon's legacy wasn't just at risk. It had already been gambled, borrowed, and promised to wolves who had never set foot in our family home. Patrick had tried to sell a man's lifetime of sweat like it was some cheap prize at a pawn shop. I closed the folder, my fingers pressing hard against the edges, and whispered to myself in that small lavender-scented room, "Not on my watch." Because what Patrick failed to remember was that Vernon left his name on more than just paper. He left it in me, in the discipline he taught, in the records he kept, and in the grandson sleeping peacefully down the hall. Patrick had woven a web of lies so wide he thought it would trap me. But webs don't just trap, they reveal the spider. And I was ready to drag him out into the open. Courtrooms have a way of shrinking people. The benches are hard, the ceilings high, the walls too white. Every sound echoes, heels on tile, papers shuffling, the scratch of a pen across a legal pad. But nothing echoed louder than the voice of my 9-year-old grandson. Javon looked small in that chair. His feet didn't reach the floor, swinging back and forth just above the tile. They had him sit at the front, near the judge, where everyone could see him. Patrick sat just a few feet away, his face pale, jaw clenched. Kenyatta avoided everyone's eyes, staring down at her lap. And me, I sat gripping the edge of the pew. My heart split in two, one part breaking that a child had been dragged into the ugliness of adult sins, the other swelling with a pride so fierce it nearly knocked me over. The judge leaned down, voice softened for a boy's ears. "Do you understand why you're here today, son?" Javon nodded, his voice barely above a whisper at first. "Yes, sir." "Tell us what you remember." The judge said. For a second, silence. Then Javon lifted his chin, his eyes darting to me like he needed my strength. I gave him a small nod, the kind only a grandmother can give, that says, "I'm here, baby, tell it true." He took a breath. That morning, Grandma was about to drink coffee, but I heard my mom and dad talking the night before. They thought I was asleep, but I wasn't. They said the coffee would make her gone before the meeting. His voice cracked, but he pressed on. So when I saw her with the cup, I shouted. I said, "Grandma, don't drink it. Mommy did something bad." The courtroom went still. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Patrick shifted in his chair, his lawyer whispering in his ear, but the weight of a child's words can't be undone by strategy. Kenyatta's shoulders hunched tighter, her hands gripping the fabric of her skirt until her knuckles turned white. Javon kept speaking, his voice steadier now, like he knew the truth was carrying him. I heard them talk about money, about the house, about the meeting. My dad said if Grandma was gone, everything would be easier. He told my mom to do it. I felt tears sting my eyes, not just from the pain of hearing my son's betrayal laid bare, but from the strength of a boy who should have been outside riding his bike, not testifying against his own parents. My chest ached, but in that ache was also a swell of something Vernon would have recognized, pride. The judge leaned back, expression unreadable, but the silence in the room said more than any gavel could. A child's voice had cut through the legal jargon, the forged papers, the excuses. Truth had come out not in ink, but in innocence. When Javon stepped down from that chair, he walked straight toward me. I opened my arms and pulled him close, pressing my cheek against his hair. He smelled faintly of soap and pencil shavings. I whispered, "You did good, baby. You did good." In that moment, I realized something no amount of betrayal could steal. Vernon's legacy wasn't just in property or bank accounts. It was in Javon, in his courage, in the blood that ran stronger than greed. And as I held him, I knew the tide had turned. Lies could twist, debts could drown, but truth, spoken from the mouth of a child, was a force no courtroom could ignore. If arrogance had a face, it was Kenyatta's the day she sat across from the judge. She walked in with her chin lifted, her hair pulled so tight it looked painful, her suit jacket buttoned like armor. She thought posture could shield her, that a straight back and a stubborn glare would hold against the tide already crashing around her. Her lawyers started first, painting her as a stressed young wife, overwhelmed by grief, by debt, by life's pressures. "There is no proof," he said, his voice sharp, "that my client poisoned anyone. There was no toxicology report on the coffee, no fingerprints, no confession." And then Kenyatta spoke, her voice steady, almost rehearsed. "I never touched her coffee. I never harmed Mrs. Glass. I loved her like my own mother." Her eyes darted toward me, cold, like she dared me to contradict her. But the walls of that courtroom were already closing in. The lawyer for our side placed the forged will on the stand, sliding it into the judge's hands. Two versions laid out side by side, the real one Vernon signed years before, and Patrick's sloppy counterfeit. The differences shouted louder than any denial. The jagged signature, the date that didn't match, the property description written in words Vernon would never have chosen. The judge's brows knitted, his fingers drumming the edge of the paper. "Mrs. Glass," he said, turning toward me, "where did you find this?" "In my son's drawer," I answered, voice steady though my chest burned. "Among bills he'd hidden, promises he couldn't keep." Then Javon's testimony echoed again, this time read aloud from the transcript. His small words carried more weight than any adult argument. "Grandma, don't drink it. Mommy did something bad." The silence that followed was heavier than iron. Kenyatta's lips tightened, her face flushing, but still she clung to her line. "He's a child. Children misunderstand. I would never." But the evidence stacked higher. Bank statements, emails, Patrick's own notes where he promised inheritance money that wasn't his, and her fingerprints, not on the mug, but on a letter tucked in the pile, her signature co-signing a debt Patrick had assured would be cleared once I was out of the way. Her voice cracked then, though she tried to cover it. "That doesn't mean I poisoned anything. I never." The judge cut her short, his tone sharper now. "You sit here insisting innocence, but the weight of evidence says otherwise. A child's testimony, a forged will, debts tied directly to promises of a dead man's estate. You can deny all you want, but the facts leave very little room for doubt." I watched as Kenyatta's shoulders sagged, the straight line of her spine bending for the first time. The mask of arrogance slipped, and underneath was desperation, raw and ugly. She looked to Patrick for rescue, but he sat rigid, his jaw locked, eyes fixed forward, as though if he stayed still enough he could disappear. It was in that moment I saw her for what she truly was, not a mastermind, not a victim of circumstance, but a willing accomplice who thought she could outrun truth. But truth had caught her. Her last stand wasn't noble. It wasn't brave. It was the final thrash of a woman who thought she could rewrite a widow's fate and profit from it. And as her words fell flat, as her defenses crumbled, the unraveling was complete. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just sat there, steady, with Vernon's true will in my lap and Javon's hand in mine. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't shouting over your enemy. It's watching them collapse under the weight of their own lies. The day the judge read his ruling, the air inside that courtroom felt so heavy I could hardly breathe. I had sat through weeks of filings, hearings, and evidence laid out like bricks in a wall no man could climb. Still, nothing prepared me for the sound of my son's name being cut away from his father's legacy. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. Given the forged document presented, the fraudulent financial promises made against the estate, and the corroborated testimony provided in this court, the claims of Mr. Patrick Glass to his father's estate are hereby struck. All accounts connected to the inheritance will remain frozen until they are transferred under the rightful authority of Mrs. Melba Glass. The words landed with finality, echoing through every corner of the room. Papers shuffled, lawyers murmured, but for me, the world narrowed down to one image, Patrick's face. My only son, the child I once cradled against my chest, sat slumped at the defense table, eyes wide like he'd just realized the ground beneath him had disappeared. I felt no triumph in that moment, only the hollow weight of truth. Justice had been served, but it cut me just as deep as it cut him. Vernon and I had worked a lifetime, so Patrick would never have to crawl through poverty as we once did. And now here he was, stripped not by chance, not by enemies, but by his own hand. The clerk began reading through the details, line by line. Rental properties secured to me. Savings protected under my name. Pension untouchable by Patrick's reach. Even the family home he had once promised away to creditors now stood firmly in my possession. Every brick Vernon laid was rescued from being sold off like cheap stock. Patrick's lawyer leaned close, whispering urgently, but Patrick sat frozen. His hands fidgeted against the table, his jaw tight, his eyes darting to the floor as if he couldn't bear to look at me. For a moment, I almost wished he would. I almost wished he'd meet my eyes and say something, anger, regret, anything human. But there was nothing, just silence, broken only by the scratching of pens and the ticking of the courtroom clock. The judge continued, his tone stern. The forged will has been entered into evidence. Criminal charges for fraud remain pending. But as for this court's decision, Mr. Glass, you are removed from consideration as heir to this estate. Removed. Such a simple word, but it struck harder than any punishment I could have imagined. Patrick's name was gone from the line his father had drawn in trust, erased like chalk from a board. I sat back, my fingers gripping the arms of the bench, my heart torn between grief and grim resolve. I had saved Vernon's legacy, but in the process, I had watched my son become an outcast. Not because the world was cruel, but because he chose lies over love, greed over family. As we rose to leave, I looked once more at Patrick. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just sat there, the weight of his own betrayal crushing him in a room full of witnesses. I walked out with Javon's hand in mine, the lawyer carrying Vernon's true will in his briefcase, and the knowledge that the Glass name would carry on, but not through the son who bore it. Patrick had stripped himself bare, and all the court had done was put it on record. If stripping Patrick from Vernon's estate was justice for the past, then what came next was justice for the future. The custody hearing, a place where I had to prove not that I could raise a child. I had already raised one, but that I could shield Javon from the very people who gave him life. The courtroom felt different this time, not tense like a trial, but heavy with something deeper, the question of where a child belongs. Javon sat beside me before the session began, swinging his legs nervously, clutching the little bear Vernon once bought him at a county fair. He didn't understand the paperwork, the lawyers, the motions, but he understood this. His voice had already saved my life, and now it might decide his own. Patrick and Kenyatta entered together, though they looked more like strangers than husband and wife. Their faces were pale, drawn tight from weeks of unraveling. Their lawyer tried to make them appear as victims of circumstance, a family under stress, a boy's words misinterpreted, no proven harm. But every argument sounded thin, like a sheet pulled over a broken frame. When it was my turn, I didn't bring theatrics. I brought truth. I spoke of the night Javon stood in my kitchen, the whispered conversations he overheard, the forged will I carried to the lawyer's desk. I spoke of the banister that nearly sent me tumbling, the food that sickened only me, the hiss of gas that could have ended us all. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. The weight of fact was enough. Then the judge looked at Javon. "Son, do you feel safe with your parents?" Javon's voice was quiet, but it carried through the entire room. "No, sir. I feel safe with Grandma." His small hand reached for mine, and I felt my heart swell and ache at once. A child should never have to speak such words. But he did, with a bravery far beyond his 9 years. The judge's eyes softened, then turned cold as he faced Patrick and Kenyatta. "This court finds that you are unfit to parent. The welfare of the child outweighs all else. Custody of Javon Glass is granted in full to his grandmother, Mrs. Melba Glass." The sound of his gavel was like a door slamming shut. Relief rushed through me, hot and overwhelming, tears spilling before I could stop them. Not tears of sorrow, but of resolve, of release. I pulled Javon into my arms, holding him close, whispering into his hair, "You're home now. You're safe." Across the aisle, Patrick lowered his head, hands covering his face. Kenyatta's mouth twisted, but no words came. They had lost more than money, more than property. They had lost their son, the boy they tried to use as a silent witness to murder, the child they thought would never speak. As we left the courtroom, Javon's small hand tucked in mine, I felt Vernon's presence walking beside us. His legacy wasn't just brick and savings. It was the boy whose life was now placed in my care. And for the first time since his passing, I felt I had given him something back, the assurance that what he built would not be lost, and his grandson would be raised in truth, not lies. The battle over inheritance was nearly done, but this custody ruling was the real victory, because a house without love is just wood and nails. But a child raised in safety, carrying the name of a grandfather who lived with honor, that is legacy made flesh. There comes a day when the walls of a house stop feeling like shelter and start whispering reminders of every shadow that ever passed through. That's what my home became after Patrick and Kenyatta. Every floorboard I stepped across, every cabinet I opened carried the echo of whispers, of lies, of a cup of coffee that nearly carried me to the grave. So I made a choice. I sold the house Vernon and I had built with our own hands. It wasn't an easy decision. That porch had seen my son take his first steps. That kitchen had smelled of Vernon's cornbread on Sundays. But love isn't in wood, and memories don't live in bricks. They live in people, and the people I had left needed more than a monument to the past. They needed a future. The papers were signed on a quiet Thursday. I watched a young couple walk through the door with their baby on a hip, wide-eyed at the thought of owning their first home. I didn't tell them what had happened inside those walls. That wasn't their burden to carry. For them, it would be a place of beginnings. For me, it was the closing of a book that had been stained with betrayal. With the proceeds, I sat down with my lawyer and opened a trust in Javon's name. Every penny, every cent that Vernon worked for, was redirected toward the boy who saved my life with 9 words spoken in a kitchen doorway. "Grandma, don't drink it. Mommy did something bad." I made sure no creditor, no forged paper, no greedy hand could ever touch it. When Javon comes of age, he will inherit not just money, but the story of a grandfather who built with sweat and a grandmother who refused to let it be squandered. I remember sitting at the bank, signing the final document, and feeling Vernon with me, his voice, steady as always, whispering, "You did right, Melba. You kept it safe." Patrick and Kenyatta lost everything, property, standing, even the right to raise the boy they once tried to use as a pawn. Their debts remain their own. Heavy chains they forged link by link. And me, I walk forward lighter, not because I wasn't cut, but because I chose not to bleed out. Now, each morning, I watch Javon eat his breakfast before school, his backpack bouncing as he heads out the door. His laughter fills rooms where grief once lingered. He is my reminder that survival isn't just about living through poison. It's about planting seeds where betrayal tried to burn the ground. Vernon's legacy didn't die with him. It lives in that boy's smile, in the way he holds his pencil tight as he scribbles math problems, in the way he leans into me when I read him bedtime stories. It lives in the truth that no lie, no forged will, no cup of poison could erase what we built together. So this is my final word. Survival is the sweetest revenge. Justice may stumble, but it catches up. And legacy, it's not in the house you sell, but in the child you raise. That is what I carried forward. That is what I reclaimed. And if you're still listening, remember this. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't striking back at those who wronged you. It's making sure their poison never touches the future you protect.